Thank you, Elena, and welcome everyone. I'm gonna start sharing my screen, if that's possible to stop sharing your screen so I can do that. And then I reckon, okay.
Great.
Can everybody see my slides?
That
Looks great.
Lovely, great, fantastic. Welcome everyone. Yeah, it's great to see people still coming in. So, and happy to see so many people registering to coming to our lab session, which will be today around conducting rigorous impact evaluations, which we will term IE, yeah, from now onwards, on food systems in humanitarian emergency and conflict settings, which we will term as HEX from now onwards. Yeah, that's just to help with the kind of abbreviations. So we will learn about doing IE in HEX. Yeah, so I hope that this kind of two terms kind of stick with you. So as we move along and through this lab. Today we have around 2 hours together, and I'm just going to go briefly through the outline of what we're going to do today in this learning lab. First, I'm going to do some bit of introduction about who we are. So that might be interesting for you as ISDC, International Security and Development Center, but also as the three speakers that will be giving the learning lab today. Then we'll speak a little bit about what are generally impact evaluations. I know some of you might know that and why we should do them in HEX, but it's good to kind of have a reminder again of why these things are important. Third, we'll have an interactive example where you will provide your input about what you know about impact evaluations, what you've done it. I'm going to explain a case study, and then you're going to provide us the input. So that's going to take around 20-25 minutes. So we'll be happy if you kind of engage. That will be done through Mentimeter, and we'll provide the code afterwards. Then my colleague Melody will speak about the challenges, generally, both practical, methodological, and ethical challenges, more specifically in conducting impact evaluation in HEX, just kind of to set the stage a little bit. We will then briefly discuss the results from your inputs and try to kind of do some cross sections to understand how different people responded differently and from your experience and whatnot. And finally, I will speak a little bit more about how we can design and implement impact evaluations in HEX and what kind of more about the methods that we can use, what data we can use, and I kind of provide some example. And finally, Tillman will conclude. And in between, we'll have some burning questions. So please do use the QA function, right? And the people who like questions, please do upvote it. Yeah. So first, maybe just briefly, so what is ISDC? ISDC is a non-for-profit academic institute. We're based, all of us, in Berlin, and we conduct research specifically to improve lives and livelihoods, so at the very micro level, shaped, especially for households who are shaped by violent conflict, any type of fragility and humanitarian emergencies, right? So, and we rely mainly on the relief and the power of data and evidence to help to understand and alleviate suffering around the world. And this is the link to our newsletter. So if you're interested to know more about our research and work, please do take a screenshot of that and sign up. Yes, so we were founded in 2014, and the main idea of that academic work we're doing is to bridge two themes, one of security and conflict and fragility, as I said, on one hand, but also economic development, food security, and other kind of aspects related to the welfare and livelihoods of households. And we also work on the intersection between both academic institutes, so we kind of collaborate with universities as well, but as well as policy and practice. So we kind of try to bridge all these different spaces together. And we do love data and do data collection and analysis. You're going to hopefully see that throughout the kind of the presentation in that, right? So, and specifically, we do work in doing impact evaluations, particularly in crisis settings. We know we try to do it as much as rigorous and theory-based as possible and to kind of build on this expertise, but we also understand the limitations of doing very kind of high rigorous impact evaluations that we used to do it, for example, in other more peaceful settings. So therefore, we can also strive to kind of learn more about how the crisis shapes people's behavior and the programming run by itself, and draw kind of economic more theory, but as well as kind of apply new methods and rigorous methods to help kind of move this forward. Your experts today, we're going to have Professor Tillman Burke, who is the founder and director of ISDC. He's also a professor of economic development and food security at the Humboldt University of Berlin. And he also co-director of the Household in Conflict Network. We published lots of work about, since 20 years, I think now, Tillman, lots of work and conferences that study the impact of households in conflict settings. And his research focuses mainly on the economics of household behavior and well-being in areas affected by violent conflict. And he has published over 60 articles in journals like the Journal of Development Economics, Journal of European Economic Association, Journal of Peace Research. So happy to have you here, Tillman, with us today. Also, we'll be joined by Melody Dakash. She's a researcher and a PhD candidate at the Humboldt University in Berlin. She had studied nutrition and public health beforehand, and now she's doing her work with ISDC and at Humboldt to do impact evaluations in Syria, particularly around both combining impact evaluations interventions related to nutrition and agriculture, but as well how's that interact with programs to reduce violence against women and girls. So, and she will today talk a little bit more about the kind of the challenges of doing from her own experience and other experience doing impact evaluations in such very high difficult conflict settings. So welcome, Melody. And finally, it's me. So, and I'm Ghassan Balik, and I'm the director of the Welfare Research Program at ISTC and a guest researcher at the Tyre Institute at the Humboldt University of Berlin. I'm mainly interested also to do impact evaluations in humanitarian settings, as well as apply kind of novel methods to understand how we can measure things better with big data, as well as kind of try to bring this rigorous evidence into the humanitarian sector, more generally speaking. So welcome, and we hope that you will enjoy what we have to offer today. As I said, some additional housekeeping to what Elena has said. So this training will contain an interactive exercise using Mentimeter, so we would appreciate later on to kind of sign on. As we said, you ask with the Q&A, and we will try to get those burning questions here and there, and the training is being recorded. So for now, I'm happy to continue doing the slides, but I will hand to Tillman to introduce us about what rigorous impact evaluations are. Tillman, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Ghassan, and welcome to everybody. Thank you for your interest in our work. So I just want to look at these two important questions to set the scene. First, run briefly through what rigorous impact evaluations are, and then why they matter in these very difficult and challenging contexts where they traditionally haven't been applied very much. Next slide, please. So just some basic terminology, just so we're all on the same page. We're obviously interested in interventions that affect people in some amount, in some direction, in a particular dimension, and that's important. And we'll come back to that later. You know what outcome exactly we mean, and then we have to be very clear about who we're talking about. And we have an example here. For example, you know, a particular UN program, could be an NGO program, caused, and this is important. It's not just something that happens sort of coincidentally, but there's really a causal relationship. This is what we're trying to identify. For example, a 5% increase. It could have been a decrease, you know, in food security. Among a specific group, say adults in Yemen. Yeah, and so we're very specific here in multiple ways, right? We're specific about who does what and what impact it has on which outcome among which population. And the way we measure that is that we check the difference over time. But that the problem is that if we only have people who were treated, you know, there's something which is not observable, right? So we don't know what happened to people who wouldn't have had the intervention, and so we need to find a control group. We need to find a group that's otherwise similar, so that we can derive lessons from that. And the important thing is that this is if we follow this sort of approach, then we have rigorous impact evaluations, which really enable causal identification. We also want it ideally to be theory-based and not just like, you know, digging through some data, but, you know, there may be a reason why we expect to see food security increase if you give, I don't know, you know, food aid or seeds or agricultural training to people, yeah? We also want to check if there are unintended consequences not shown in the example, but it could be that the UN program leads to, you know, also I don't know, increased displacement. You know, maybe people rush over to get the aid in a particular location where aid is being distributed, and they leave an area where no aid is coming. Maybe that causes harm, and so we also want to study that if possible. Next slide, please. So just to run this through an example, let's imagine we have this tiny nuclear family here, or two tiny nuclear families pre-intervention, you know, 2 parents, 2 kids. And these look very similar, right? They're the same size family. They both have a boy and a girl. They both have 2 parents, etc. So, here's our treatment group and our control group. They're both identical. There's no difference between them, right? Now let's assume one of them gets some benefits. Yeah. Then what happens? Next slide, please. Then, and here you can look at the difference post-intervention. You see that the kids in the treatment group, they developed, maybe they had schooling, school meals, food aid, whatever. And unfortunately, the kids in control group, they didn't develop. Yeah, and I come back to the ethics and things like that in a moment. But just mathematically, we can now take the difference between the treatment group and the control group if we're interested in the children, and we see that the dark blue at the bottom underneath the line is by how much more they grew, and that is then the net causal effect of the intervention. Why is it causal? Because the 2 groups were the same, except one got a treatment and the other didn't. Yeah, and so that allows us to assign the difference, and that's really what we are after. If we'd only watched the treatment group and the kids grow, we wouldn't have known if it had been the intervention, or maybe it was just good luck or good rains or whatever. That could have been many reasons, but like this, they all got the same rain, they all got the same luck. The only difference was one of them got the treatment, the other didn't. It's very similar to what you do in medical studies to try to find out if the vaccine works or not. Next slide, please. Now, sometimes in the pre-intervention group, in the starting phase, we don't have like this nuclear family on the left-hand side with a boy and a girl. Maybe they have, 2 boys, something like that. Yeah, and so they're a little bit different from the other. So we have differences, but we have quantitative methods to account for the differences that we might observe, for example, pre-intervention. So the ideal scenario from a technical point of view, I just showed you, if it's not given, as long as we know about it, then we can try to account for that. Yeah, we can still do this post-intervention calculation on the right-hand side, except now we have a grown-up boy and a grown-up girl, and we have, 2 boys that didn't grow so much. And so, we still see this difference. And even though the groups were different, but we can try to account for that. As long as we know about these differences, we can still try to control for it. So, even if we don't have the perfect scenario, and in many conflict and humanitarian settings, we don't have perfect scenarios, we can still learn something, and that's important to bear in mind. So next slide, please. So that's basically what impact evaluation is. And I realize the whole range of issues, is it ethical to assign treatment randomly and so on? And many times it's not. So we have to account for that. But just to understand what the basic concept is that we're looking at, and the advantage being this causal identification. Now, why would you want to do that in a hex setting? Next slide, please. Well, one thing is that if we increase the number of methods, how we can learn, whether it's in evaluation or whether it's in research, if we just generally speaking want to learn about the world around us and what interventions do, then like this iceberg floating through the ocean here, there's a lot of things we can see. There's things which meet the eye, but there's a lot of stuff which is hidden in the water, right? What is it, 9/10 or so is hidden in the water? And in a sense, we want to uncover that, right? We're interested in all sorts of questions. We want to learn about these humanitarian emergency and conflict settings. We want to know what it's like to work there. What are the chances of interventions working? We want to try to understand the culture of the organizations that provide there. So there is a lot we can learn, and we want to share that, and we want it to be relevant. So impact evaluation in HEX is basically another string to bow. So it's another tool in the toolkit, and it can be useful under certain circumstances. Next slide, please. Here's an example of a study we did in Northeast Nigeria for and with the FAO. On the left-hand side, you see the full sample of households and their food consumption score. Some of them had assistance, that's the taller bar in the light shaded. Some of them didn't have assistance, that's the bold color in the darker shade. And you see that their food consumption score, so their food security, was higher if they had assistance. But if we only watch the blue bar, then maybe it's not so we don't necessarily know everything about them. We then started disaggregating the displaced versus the non-displaced, and then we also disaggregated the different settings, and we found that in extreme conflict settings the intervention had a really strong positive impact. On the right hand side, the red bar, the light red, the pink, the light red, the pink is much higher than the dark red without assistance. And so the intervention, had strong heterogeneous impacts, particularly worked for displaced people in green, but it particularly also worked in high conflict settings on the far right. And so it really pushed from poor food security to, higher borderline food security. And so this really showed that for some population subgroups, the intervention really worked. Interestingly, in the low conflict setting, the difference between the dark red and the light red is like minimal. It basically had no impact. So, running rigorous studies in really difficult settings can tell you about how the program works and under which conditions it works and for whom it works. And that's really worth knowing, that if you want to help in Northeast Nigeria, households displaced or otherwise suffering from conflict, you shouldn't apply the same intervention to everybody. You should target it depending on the circumstances and the target group. And so if we hadn't done a study like this, we might not have known that. Maybe there are other ways of finding it out, but this is one way, one string to the bow. Yeah. So next slide, please. But what we also really want to know is, if something doesn't work, why does it not work? And here is an example of a study we did in Niger once, where we found that some of the food security interventions weren't necessarily working very well unless households also got help with livelihood interventions like agricultural interventions, this half-moon farming you see in the top right, where you catch the rain when it does come. So just providing the bumpy nut to the hungry children didn't really protect them unless the family also got help with the intervention. So again, we need to understand how different interventions combine, and we need to go beyond siloed thinking. We need to think about integrating interventions, and we need to think about having a critical mass of interventions. And this focus on mechanisms is something that impact evaluation can really deliver very well. What I like to say is that impact evaluation is a process. We can really try to help people on the ground in the field to learn as they work with us impact evaluators to figure out what works and what doesn't work. And that's a really valuable process. It's not just the study at the end that comes out, it's also what people learn on the way there. Next slide, please. So basically, in summary, we can organize learning and sort of figure it out for ourselves. And then we're really glad that we figured something out. That's learning as a private good. You have your cake and you eat it, and you might be happy having eaten it. But what's really much more important is learning as a public good. We want to share knowledge. We want to make it available. We want to take other people with us. We want to learn the external validity of our studies. If you do it in this one context, is it also valid in other contexts? And so impact evaluators are well suited to organizing learning processes and learning agendas and letting other people contribute in this. And so if we're committed to sharing our insights, then learning can become a public good and the whole discipline can learn from it. And then it could be that after we've done a couple of studies, we've figured this problem out and we can move on and it's become a stylized fact on how to do that. So we need to move our learning culture. I'll come back to that at the end of this session. We need to probably move our learning culture to having more learning as a public good. So sharing our results and letting other people participate in our learning. And I think that's really valuable. So over and back to Hassan now to give an example of how to conduct impact evaluation. Thank you.
Lovely, great. Thank you very much, Tilman, for the introduction. And yeah, please do ask your questions if you have any into Q&A, and we're happy to look into them and kind of try to answer them as much as possible. And now I'm just gonna move to the next section of our talk, and then first maybe now you get to know us. We want also to get to know you, and we want to do that through kind of get an interactive example of how we can conduct an impact evaluation in a hex setting. So what I will do in the next session is I will introduce a scenario, which is generally hypothetical, about a kind of a dilemma which an organization has in terms of what to implement, which type of intervention to implement in a humanitarian conflict settings related to food systems, and how we can kind of provide additional learning. And we will set these examples, and we will also then move to Mentimeter afterwards to get your responses about what intervention you would choose and what other methods you would implement if you had this dilemma, and just to get to know a little bit about kind of the responses and the different responses, and that kind of help us kind of shape the rest of this learning lab. So I hope you will have fun doing that as well. So the setting here just to set it because earlier, so we know that Yemen is one of the most devastated countries that has been ongoing conflict and other kind of humanitarian disasters in the past 10 years mainly, and which has caused widespread food insecurity and many displacement particularly across farmers, which has led to significant loss of productive assets and farming skills, right? So there's an estimation from OCHA that around 18 million Yemenis are in need of humanitarian assistance, and around 17 million, which is part of those, around 90%, if not more, are food insecure and they require of food. Yeah, we also know, on the other hand, it's not just that 70% of the population in Yemen relies on income from agricultural activities. So they're mainly farmers, so they grow crops, yeah, mainly local crops, and as well as they're food secure, right? So you have kind of this issue, yeah. And we know that in Yemen as well, given the ongoing conflict and the political landscape, that's very difficult to operate. Maybe some of you have tried to work there or not, or do research there, but as well implement, collect data and monitor programs to the incoming conflict. Yeah, but that doesn't make it less important to be able to know what works and what doesn't work. Yeah, so we have this setting in mind. So please do keep it on as soon as when we kind of answer the questions, right? So based on a rapid needs assessment, an INGO, International Non-Governmental Organization, has identified 100 communities in Yemen with about 15,000 farming households in need of support. Yeah, and based on a budget constraint, this INGO can either provide an intervention A, which is food assistance packages. These food assistance packages can cover the caloric intake of all the 15,000 farming households for a period of 3 months. Yeah. Okay. So this is the first intervention that they can do. Or they can do with the same amount of budget and the same amount of period, also within the 100 communities, they can do intervention B, which provide only 6,000 households within these 100 communities with seeds and agricultural inputs, yeah, to grow wheat, for example, to improve the local production of the food in Yemen, yeah, which is theorized, quote unquote, to have a spillover effect on the markets and probably improve the food security of other members in the community, right? So in the kind of a little bit more the shorter term. So we kind of see this kind of two options of the interventions, kind of the program design or the program implementer. Yeah, it has we want to help them to kind of choose A or choose B. Yeah, okay, yeah. Okay, but now they called Ghassan, and Ghassan said, let us know you have done research. Tillman, you have done research. Let us know what we know already, yeah, which one to use. And we can say, well, we know that in-kind food assistance, particularly irregular food assistance, yeah, for shorter periods, not very continuous, can improve food access and food security of vulnerable households in the very immediate term, right? However, we know from the evidence that it doesn't improve self-sufficiency, particularly after support ends. So after those 3 months, these households will become food insecure again, right? So this is kind of important to note, yeah? But also we do not know at all the positive and negative, as Tillman said, and intended, unintended as well, longer term effects, especially in areas affected by severe conflict, right? So providing this thing that might create tensions within the communities, but also we don't know even the longer term, because how that kind of feed back into the conflict, right? So it's a little bit of a black box in a sense, right? So we know it works for the short term, but not more than that. Alternatively, for small-scale agriculture support, like what intervention B does, yeah, in terms of provision of seeds, we know we see no immediate effect in improving food security, which makes sense unless people consume the grains themselves. But generally, we don't see any kind of improvement in direct food security levels. However, we know evidence from multiple countries also affected by conflict and the humanitarian settings that in the shorter to medium term, at least 6 months to 1 year, and even longer, we see improvement in production, that's clear, and we see improvement in food security, yeah, directly for the beneficiaries, yeah, that receive the inputs, right, which probably could be an income effect in a sense. But we don't have a clear evidence on within the community spillover effects, right? So this is what we theorized originally, that other households, yeah, other than those 6,000 households, if they're going to benefit also improving their food security. But this is what kind of, I think, building the food systems, right? You want to improve local production and you want to improve the market access and linkages, but we don't know that. Yeah, this is something still to learn and to do. Yeah. So now we have both interventions we can implement. We know what we already from the literature, but still some kind of learning and evidence gaps that we need to kind of provide here. So here's the ethical, I call it the ethical dilemma, but it could be on multiple dimensions as well, right? So either we choose A, which we ensure food assistance now for all households, although it's going to be short-lived. Yeah. Choose B, support fewer households with the knowledge that the impacts are more sustainable, or we can use some combination of A and B, yeah, to kind of address direct needs now and maybe build some more resilience for the other of households, right? And in terms of the learning, yeah, we can, the question might be asked, is there a way to compare which intervention works best in both the short and then the longer term? I think that's kind of important, particularly for the case of Yemen, and particularly how we can measure the impacts of these interventions. And again, what about those spillover effects? Yeah, so I hope this kind of sets it up. So would be great. I will leave it this for 30 seconds now. If you can jump into the Mentimeter. So I think you have to scan the code, and then I will ask some questions, and then you will provide your answers to them based on this example. Great. Okay. Question. Great. Hopefully somebody's in the chat. Can you? Great, 31. We're still getting some responses. Now is your last chance if you want to contribute. Lovely. Great. Okay. Move to the next question. And do you have experience in conducting impact evaluations as per defined by Tillman? Yes or no? Consistent. Great. 32. Now we'll move to the next question. Do you have experience working on humanitarian emergency and conflict settings? No. Move. Great. I think everybody has answered. We have 32. Okay, so now that you have the choice, what gives the example, which intervention would you choose based on what I said? Would you choose intervention A, food assistance, intervention B, the agriculture support, or a combination of A and B? Now it's your chance. Okay, 37, we have more votes, 38. Lovely, great. Okay, we'll move to the 39, still coming 40 participants. Lovely, great, thank you. I think we'll move to the next question now. And it's more about, do you think it is feasible to conduct impact evaluations in humanitarian conflicts, emergency and conflict settings, as defined? Wait a couple of seconds. Just 5 nays. Okay, we'll accept that. And if you had the chance to do any impact evaluations or learning more generally, which was the main learning method would you choose? I gave here 5 responses. So you can do randomized control trials, which is RCTs, to randomize who receive supports or not. We can do something called a quasi-experimental approach with a control group where we don't randomize, but we try to find a control group to look similar, like what also Tillman mentioned, or do some qualitative work, like focus group discussions, or related to key informant interviews, or we do just a project end-line evaluation, or you don't think there's for this case, learning required. So please, your answers. What I mean with the project end-line evaluation is that we just go at the end of the program intervention, and then we do a post end-line evaluation to see if it was effective. And yeah, it's not as rigorous as impact evaluations, generally speaking. Okay, I think we'll wait for a couple of more responses if you want to give them. Yeah, definitely a multiple combination of different interventions might also be important. Yeah. Okay, and generally speaking, if you had the chance, which type of data would you mainly use? Yeah, if you had the chance to choose one main of data. So either to do face-to-face interview survey data, phone or remote surveys, given the setting. You only do key informant interviews with specific people, and this can be based on the previous response. Use only external data like admin data, or other or no data. So please think what you might believe is the right thing to do in such a setting, like what I explained in Yemen. Chanced. Okay. The question, do you think it's ethical, and I think I'm kind of underlying the word ethical here, is to randomize who receives intervention A or who receives intervention B, right? Intervention A was the food assistance, and intervention B is the agricultural seed support. Do you think it is ethical to do so? Great. Okay, 36 responses, 23% said no, so around 1/3 to 2/3 think it is unethical to randomize who receives assistance. Great. Okay, so now I would like you, now it's not a multiple choice, I would leave it up to you. So, but if you can provide one word, literally, you can use whatever word you want, but one word that describes the main challenge in conducting or for conducting impact evaluation hacks. It could be the word security, it could be safety, it could be ethics, whatever you think. I don't want to prime you, but and then we will see what's people mainly Great. I think we've got most responses, and I think here it speaks clearly that the instability, which I think means that we're not be able, if I understood it correctly, right? It's not able to kind of follow up with the impact evaluations because things might change, either in terms of the interventions, maybe not taking place as supposed it should take place, but also in terms of data collection and kind of to ensure the validity of the designs. Also, the security, it seems lots of people have also mentioned security as an issue in terms of being able to kind of the security of probably the enumerators, the respondents, as well as the researchers. I think the urgency, which I also kind of might tie, generally speaking, with the needs that we need now to intervene and provide support without kind of delays. Yeah, and I think that might think. I saw lots of here, they don't different biases, and I think that's also kind of key. We will talk about those different biases much more clearly. I think that will Melody will do later on. And definitely transparency we see as well as the ability to be able to monitor and the feasibility. Yeah. So, and I think this is kind of clearly most of these challenges, both as you see, there's some ethical dimensions for it. Like, is it safe? Is it secure that we can go there? There's more practical challenges, or because of the urgency about who we can randomize, or can we access the field? Can we have proper protocols in place? There's also methodological ones, right? Which is the attrition, which is the different biases that might be attrition, contamination, other things that usually in an impact evaluation we have much more control of as researchers and other meal evaluators, but we might not have that so as well in the in emergency settings, right? So thanks for your responses. That's well taken. What we will now we will move to Melody, who will talk to us about the ethical and practical methodological challenge. So building on the last what we've said, so we kind of maybe highlight them a bit more clearly. Melody, would you like to present your screen?
Okay, thank you so much, Ghassan. Thank you everyone for submitting your responses. And very nice to see that most of you actually reported that impact evaluation are feasible in conflict settings. But this comes also with some ethical, practical, and methodological challenges. And this is what we're gonna be discussing in this session. So we know that ethics is the foremost of conducting impact evaluation. It's the foremost concern in conducting impact evaluation. And here we're going to be discussing about the main ethical challenges that we face when conducting impact evaluation in conflict settings. The first one is our concern, or our main concern, is that sometimes we need to withhold the program from the control group. Like Tillman has mentioned on how to conduct impact evaluation in conflict settings, we need to have an intervention group which will be receiving the assistance, but also another control group that will not be receiving the assistance. And this is one of the challenges that we face, is that to keep a control group without receiving any intervention, to be able to compare the two groups together. And this is one of the challenges that we face. The other one is to compromise. Sometimes the ethic protocols are also compromised. And here we are talking more about the informed consent and the voluntarily consent also to take from the participants. Like, for example, can you imagine in this, volatile settings where we have war or we have flooding, and then we go underground and we want to collect data from the people, we have to administer an informed consent. Sometimes those people are really very stressed, they are overwhelmed, they are traumatized, and they are less likely to take part in our survey. But also from the other side, those people might take part of the survey because they feel the pressure to do that, especially when these organizations who are collecting data are the same people who will also be delivering the intervention itself. So they are more likely to take part of the study just to be able to receive, thinking that they would receive the intervention. So this is not really voluntarily anymore, and sometimes this will affect the quality of the data that you are collecting. The third one is also imagine the same scenario where we have flooding, or we have an earthquake that is happening, and we go on the ground that we want to collect surveys from these people, especially when those surveys are very exhaustive and they ask very sensitive questions. Sometimes we are adding more additional burden on people who are already suffering from the crisis that is happening. And this is sometimes one of the most ethical challenges that we're also facing. So all these three main challenges, we can see them in any kind of hacks that you are working in, and especially when we're in the emergency phase where everyone needs to be supported, where the assistance should be delivered rapidly to everyone without any exception and without leaving anyone behind. So those are three main ethical challenges. And we have some ethical consideration that we're also gonna touch upon. It's really very important to conduct a study where it's feasible. So the feasibility and the essentiality of this study is very important. Like when we know that the study will actually build on existing evidence, where this study will generate new evidence, this is where we can do this impact evaluation study. Okay, when we know that it's going to add on, or it's going to generate more evidence for future policymakers, or for future what type of intervention to be provided in this type of setting, this is where we can conduct impact evaluation. The second one is, before we collect any data, we need to obtain the consent from participants. And we know that this is also in stable settings, but also in more conflict or humanitarian emergency settings, sometimes we need to adapt the informed consent to also accommodate more with the people who have specific disability, because sometimes we target people with disability who we consider are the most vulnerable. And so we have also to consider this in our informed consent form. And again, and the most important is that we put always the participants at the center, and we have to put all our efforts to prevent any physical, any psychological, any social harm that might be imposed to them. One of the very important ethical consideration when we work in hacks is the confidentiality and the anonymity of the participants. And this is specifically important because we could have data breach, for example, which could happen in conflict settings. And this is why only collecting data from the concerned people, only the people who are working in research or the implementing partners, where we only collect data that is actually necessary for the study, and also necessary maybe to contact the people later on in future surveys. And we have to follow very strict measures, data protection measures, just to ensure the anonymity and the confidentiality of those people. And no one outside of the research or the implementation team could have access to those, to the ID or to the names of the participants. And then sometimes it's really difficult to obtain approval from IRB really fast, because this earthquake has happened now. We need to intervene now. We have to have a very rapid response. And sometimes we cannot wait for the IRB for the process of the IRB, but sometimes also the IRB could also be expedited, especially when we're talking about acute emergencies. And we always have to follow all these safeguarding and all the ethical procedures before we go on and start the study. We also have sometimes additional safeguarding, what we call the referral procedure, to ensure the do not harm approach, especially for people with a trauma. Like, for example, we are going on the field, we know that people are experiencing violence, are experiencing war, and then we go with our survey, which sometimes could be very long and asking very sensitive questions. We always have to ensure, when we ask those questions, especially if they are sensitive, that people could experience backlash, could experience traumatization, could really be experiencing fatigue and stress. And it's very important to, this is a little bit compared to stable settings where we have always health centers that are very well functioning. In conflict settings, it could be that the health centers are not functioning anymore, or people cannot access those health centers, or sometimes they are not there. So this is why we have to ensure referral procedures. We have to ensure that the health centers are there to prevent any kind of backlash or traumatization of the participants. So this is also very important to consider in conflict settings. Now, in addition to those ethical challenges, we also face practical challenges. The intervention in emergency really we know that if an earthquake happened, we need a very immediate and rapid response that covers almost everyone who is affected by the exposure. So this is why it's sometimes practically challenging as researchers to conduct an impact evaluation, because this needs planning. We need to develop the baseline data collection. We need to train the enumerators to collect data. And this is particularly important in conflict settings where refresher trainings might be needed. More than 1 day training enumerators is also needed. And sometimes the accessibility of the field is also challenging. So this is why it's particularly challenging in terms of the practical challenges. And the second one is we have sometimes the emergencies are not always anticipated, or we cannot foresee those emergencies. And so once the exposure or once the emergency has happened, then we have not yet collected a baseline data where we could use to do our rigorous impact evaluation, like Tamer was saying before. So we need the baseline data, but also we need post-intervention data and then compare the two together. But if the emergency has happened is unanticipated, then we cannot have a baseline data where we can use. And this could also interfere with conducting rigorous impact evaluation in conflict settings. But this is also something that Ghassan will be later mentioning in his future session, how to overcome those challenges. One of also the key practical challenges that we see in conflict setting as compared to more stable settings. So in stable settings, we would imagine that the enumerator go to the field, very little chance that something happens when they are collecting the data, and everything works almost fine. But when we're conducting or collecting data in conflict setting, the whole process that takes from the data preparation to the data collection, to ensuring good data quality, to monitoring the data, all of this is somehow challenging. So that means like the data collection is challenging compared to the stable settings because we have some problems with the security. Like you can see in the first picture, for example, this is a picture from Syria during the times of war. And can you imagine the enumerators going to this setting and collecting the data from the field? So that for some security reasons, this could be challenging. But also we can see at the right side, this is a picture from South Sudan after a flood, where also we have some logistical barriers. Yeah, we have some transportation issues where enumerators cannot really easily access the areas that has been affected by the flood. And this is also another challenge that we face in conflict settings. And all these we have to account for when we are conducting the impact evaluation. We also have sometimes some issues with, getting consent from the authorities, like for example, from the municipality, especially when in times of war or in times of natural disasters where the institution maybe face a breakdown. And yeah, if you want to go to, you sometimes get, you don't sometimes get the approval or the consent to enter a village, which causes sometimes a burden on the researcher, but also on the implementers alike, because they went to this village, but then we did not get the consent to collect the data from, that they have to go again to another village. And this also is very time consuming. So this is something that we don't see in stable settings. And this is something that we have to consider in conflict settings, because the whole data collection process is really very challenging and could highly affect the quality of the data that you collect. And also as researchers, monitoring the data is also very challenging. So this is something that is very specific to the the conflict settings compared to stable settings. Now, we also have, in addition to those practical and ethical challenges, we have also methodological challenges. I saw like in the last questions that we asked on Mentimeter that a lot of people have reported bias. And this is very correct, because we have many types of biases that we can face in conflict settings. We have the selection bias, we have the information bias, we have the contamination bias that we're going to be discussing later on. One of them, which is very relevant in conflict or in hacks in general, not only in conflict settings, is the selection bias, which means imagine you are in a war and people are just constantly, and a war happens, then people are constantly moving, within the same country or across the borders. And this high displacement or migration of those people will make it very hard for us to collect the data over the time. So this is specifically the case for the panel data, or to conduct rigorous impact evaluation, where sometimes we face something what we call the non-random attrition. And the non-random attrition means that people who are more likely to be displaced, or people who are more likely to be to migrate, have maybe different characteristics of those who actually stay in the same area. And maybe they could be worse off, or they can be better off. And this is an issue here, because then we cannot really generalize our results. Yeah. And then the second one is the non-random response, is where the delivery of the intervention, for example, is more delivered to areas that are accessible. So we access this area, we provide the humanitarian assistance, we collect the data from this specific area, which is, for example, far from the flooding site. And so the people who are living on the flooding next or nearby the flooding sites are actually the worst off. So we are only collecting data from areas that are accessible, which is also not representative. So here we have to also be careful of what we call the non-random response as well. Another type of bias that we face a lot is what we call the information bias. And it's also specific. It also could happen in stable settings, but it's more enhanced in conflict settings or in hacks. And we have what we call the response recall error, which means you are collecting data from people who are very stressed, facing fatigue, who are traumatized. And so they will not really correctly 100% remember how was their conditions right before the exposure, because they're stressed and they cannot really think much. And especially if you are administering an exhaustive survey with very specific questions, it makes it even harder. So we have what we call the response recall error. And we also have what we call the respondent recall bias. And this recall bias means that exposure to conflict or exposure to humanitarian, to hacks could affect people differently within the same country. And for example, if I'm this person and I have been exposed to drought, for example, severely, or I have been exposed to drought the first time, I might remember differently from someone who has been exposed to drought, for example, many times before. And so as I intend, the person who has been just affected by drought or war or whatever for the first time, they tend to maybe over-dramatize or overestimate their conditions compared to someone who has been affected several times by drought and somehow getting used to it. And so which tend to underestimate. So this is what we also have to capture somehow, is what we call the respondent recall bias. Another very important methodological challenge is the contamination bias. And this is also one of you also have mentioned contamination bias in the Mentimeter. And this is particularly important in conflict settings. And we face it a lot. And this is when we know that the treatment group are usually the group that receives the assistance. But it happens sometimes that the control group, who are not supposed to take any intervention, ended up receiving this intervention. They have ended up receiving the intervention, maybe because our intervention to the treatment group indirectly contaminated the control group, so that also the control group now benefits from the intervention indirectly. Or it could be that other organizations who are operating in the area where we're doing the impact evaluation also ended up delivering an intervention to our control group. And this is very problematic if we don't know the stakeholders, or we don't know the implementers who are actually delivering the intervention in the area where we are doing the impact evaluation. So basically, this is what we call the contamination, or this is what we call, if our intervention indirectly benefited the control group, it's called the spillover effect, which maybe you will see it a lot when you read the papers. Or there's from the other side, where the implementers themselves just give intervention. They cover all the area where we're doing the impact evaluation, including the control group. And also this is sometimes, if this is in a non-random way, which means that only the control group has received an intervention that we don't know, because those agencies, they know that those people did not receive any intervention. This is what we call the non-random and this could really be, or could really affect our results. Because then if we see that we have a positive impact on the outcomes, we cannot just isolate the impact and say, oh yeah, this is our intervention that improved the outcomes. But it could be the combination of the interventions that we are not aware and they are taking place within the same area that actually led to this positive impact. So this is why here it's very important to know who are the stakeholders also operating within the same area where we're doing the impact evaluation, what type of intervention they have delivered, and also when did they deliver it, so we can account for this in our analysis. So just to brief as a summary, the importance, very important to consider the context. So as we said, we have the methodological, the practical, and the ethical challenges they exist when we conduct impact evaluation in HACs. And also, it's very important to know that the context or those challenges also are different depending on the nature of HACs and also depending on which phase of the emergency. Like, for example, we might pay more attention to the ethical challenges at the onset, okay, when immediately the disaster happens more than at the recovery or the long-term phase. So this is just to keep in mind that context is very key. And now we go back to Ghassan to provide us with a summary of the interactive exercise, and also Ghassan will be later also discussing about how to address those types of biases with the different designs. Yeah, so over to you, Ghassan. And if anyone has any question, please feel free to drop it in the Q&A and we will answer it as soon as we can.
Great, thank you very much.
Over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Melody. Please ask questions, right? We're here to, I see it in the chat. So maybe I think kind of, if I'm just kind of skimming through the questions, I see Simon saying, how do you go getting IRB approvals if such boards are non-existent, no longer functional in the country where the impact evaluation is going to be conducted, right? Versus like international review boards, yeah? So maybe Melody, you would like to have an answer for that?
Yeah, we usually, for example, as part of the IRB, we can submit it to institutions that are functional within the same country. Like, for example, you can submit it to a university where, yeah, if you're, like, for example, you can submit the IRB at an institution where any university, like
yeah, for example, I can give example from what we've done. For example, a project work that we've done in Syria where we cannot get IRB approvals within Syria itself, yeah, at the time. So we kind of made joint work with the university, American University of Beirut in Lebanon, where we got exemptions to do data collection as well in Syria under some agreements, right? So that makes it much more challenging. I think this is one of those things that even within the universities, even international review boards, that's both the profit and the non-for-profit, and I think maybe Tilman can speak to that as well, that there's still no expedited versions for such IRBs to help, especially if you want to respond to a humanitarian crisis, right? Say we want to do an impact evaluations in a humanitarian setting, a disaster struck, that we maybe use off-shelf designs, and maybe we have the questionnaire ready and done, and maybe we've discussed some sampling, but it reminds one of the IRBs kind of be done. Tilman, do you have a...
Yeah, just very briefly. I mean, it's important to consider ethical questions, but IRB approval is not an end in itself. I mean, the ethics matters irrespective of who gives it. So generally speaking, I would advise to try to seek approval as close to the way you conduct the study as possible, because that's more appropriate for the local context, etc. But if for some reason that's not at all possible, in the extreme, you could go, as Ghassan mentioned briefly, even for for-profit IRB approval. It's not perhaps ideal, but at least you have a process, you're thinking about it. Depending on who you are, where you work, you could also consider in your organization to have some sort of board, even ad hoc. I would always say, like, having a somewhat structured process, thinking through ethics is better than not doing it at all. Yeah. And so I think in that spirit, be better to try to have something rather than having nothing. And bear in mind, not helping and not doing studies is also not necessarily ethical, right? So if sometimes you have really tough choices to make, and then, as long as you think and reflect on it, I think that would be an improvement over the current status. I also see a question in the Q&A from Oluremi about whether, how you motivate people to be part of the control group. Yeah. And they might not get the assistance, but in some cases, you can just be very clear about it, and you can say, we have budget limitations. We cannot help everybody. We're trying to help as much as you can. But you can, for example, appeal to, altruism to some extent and say, participate, answering us some questions will still help, and it will go into the design of future programs and, help make them better. And I would say that structurally, you could either have settings where you have too much research, then it might be difficult. There's survey fatigue, or usually these sort of, HECs, these humanitarian emergencies, there's not that much work, and people understand that it's better to have some research than none. And so often I would say people are incredibly willing to give their time and to help and support. Just be super transparent about it, and don't try to pretend there is a benefit when maybe there isn't a tangible monetary benefit. Over.
Maybe just I can add to Tilman also. The second part is how you compensate for not benefiting from the assistance given. And this is usually what we do is sometimes we do the scale up of the intervention. That means that the control group now receives do not receive the intervention, but once it is proven to be effective, then we can provide the intervention for the other control group. So that's later on after the impact evaluation. And we ensure that the outcomes are actually from the intervention itself and it's beneficial, then we can provide it to the other control group. But per se, we do not we do not consent people to participate. We do not provide a compensation for people to take part of the study. We keep it voluntarily, and we ensure that this will not affect the people for receiving any intervention that they receive now, or their participation will not receiving any intervention in the future, will not be affected. Yeah. So that's, yeah.
Great, thank you both. We have one more question. Shall we take it now, like as a 1 hour mark as well, from Rabah Mansoub? She's asking, in such politically challenging settings, how do you ensure that the approvals are not conditional or biased towards certain groups? For example, in the Yemen context, the Houthis would usually dictate or control such interventions, like in terms of, so if I might understand this question, may kind of rephrase it, is that how we can ensure that who receives the benefit is not people who know people rather than people who are in need, and that how might that have impact on doing an impact evaluation as well? I'm not sure. I'm happy to answer, but if maybe Melody, you want to give it a go first.
Yeah, sure. We can. So we can both. So I can start. This is where it comes, where we very closely monitor and we collaborate very closely with the implementing partners to know who actually received what. And this is something that we do very, very frequently. We develop tracking sheets. We make sure that each person is actually receiving what is intended to receive at the beginning. And so this is, we try as much as we can to minimize it. Of course, we're not in the field to make sure that, to make sure that the actual households are actually receiving it, but we trust the partners, we work with the partners, we work very closely with them, and just to ensure that this kind of biases or, are not happening. So, Hassan, if you want to add something.
Can I maybe add, we
Yeah,
also have to differentiate, we're talking about the research and learning components here. We're not talking necessarily about the intervention as such. So, it's the implementing teams that should design the intervention and decide if it's feasible or if it's politically feasible or if it's, meaningful. We're not there to drive the intervention, so to speak. Yeah. And so as a researcher or as an evaluator, I wouldn't tell implementers what they have to do. So if the implementer thinks they can work with the powers that are to design an intervention that's fair from their point of view, then the question is, in that political environment, can we conduct an impact evaluation or any evaluation or any learning component? If people are worried about being overheard, if they give answers and they have to fear for their lives because they answer a survey, then you shouldn't do the study, of course. Yeah. So the question of whether the intervention is feasible, I might have a view on it and I have to give it, but it should be the intervention experts who design and decide that ultimately, not the researchers. Over.
Great, thank you both. And I think just to kind of add as well that, and I'm going to talk about it in the next session, that the way how you would also design the impact evaluation, you might able to kind of absorb these differences, right? So even if people who were supposed to get it didn't get it, but if you design, for example, across clusters or villages or other kind of thing that might kind of absorb these political, let's say, whatever strings, that I get it if you are not supposed to get it, or kind of things that we still be able to measure on a cluster level the impacts, right, versus others that didn't receive it. So there's multiple ways, and I think I'm going to talk about them in the next session, but maybe quickly now to briefly go through some results. I tried to manage to put the results and do some interesting findings based. This is all kind of live and ongoing. So I hope this is a bit interesting. And I know some of you have kind of answered lots of things together. So what I kind of found here, maybe of kind of the base of the results. So look in terms of the experience of doing impact evaluation in HEX. We asked you if you do experience in conducting impact evaluation, and we also asked, do you think it's ethical to randomize receipts A and B? And we saw that people who are more surprisingly who have a bit more experience conducting impact evaluations are less likely to think it is ethical to randomize. And I think that might also understand a bit of kind of maybe the challenges that you might think in terms of randomization and the needs, that it might also not be as easy as straightforward to just purely randomize who receives what interventions. Yeah. And I think I will try to build this into my next session about how we can do randomization or other quasi-experimental approaches that might be much more ethically acceptable in a sense in a humanitarian setting or not. Yeah. So here also we asked about, do you think it is feasible to conduct impact evaluation in HEX? I know most of you said yes, it is feasible, but from those who did not say, I know statistically that's not enough, but at least most of them, you see that if you never had any experience doing impact evaluations, more than likely think it's not feasible. But in general, also we see kind of between people kind of believe that it's possible. To what extent randomization, or to what other levels of feasibility, or what type of impact evaluation and rigor, that's something probably we would like to explore. Also, we asked if it's by the type of the work that you said that you do, if doing an RCT is an ethical thing, randomizing between different and here we just see a slight variation that most of the still studying don't believe it is ethical to do RCT. And so, yes, probably this is something one kind of reconsider as well as the more you get into the field, but as well as removing all the unknowns that you haven't answered for the questions. We don't see much big differences. Yeah, but researchers tend to more, of course, believe it is ethical because kind of as based off the learning versus people who don't work in research. And I think this is part of what kind of Tillman touched on in his answer, that it's also maybe unethical if we go ahead and implement something that we're not sure that it works or not, right? So if there's not enough evidence for it, yeah, that might have unintended impacts to do it. Yeah, so that might kind of be interesting. Similarly, we find just also kind of people believe that it said it's yes, it's feasible to conduct impact evaluation, and they also believe that it is ethical to actually conduct RCTs. And in terms of the learning, also we see here that most of you who said combination of A and B also believe that to do a randomized control trial might be the way forward to generate most of this learning versus others who said project endline or other qualitative work. We see also lots of people who said might be do quasi-experimental work, and I think this is something one has to reconsider in such settings, particularly that I also will address that in the next session, that we have big data everywhere and we have the methods and the tools to be able to construct counterfactuals that might help us move beyond the specific RCTs and randomization, which kind of brings it down in terms of rigor, but at the same time, it will still provide strong learning. Yeah. And finally, is the type of the data that we use for learning in HEX by the experience in the sector. And so if you have experience working in, sorry, not by sector, if you have experience in working in a humanitarian conflict, and here I'm also quite happy that lots of people said that still we can do face-to-face interviews and not rely much on phone or remote survey data, because that also might create a challenge itself, particularly in such settings. So people who have worked in such settings also kind of responded towards that to a certain extent. Great. So that's really interesting to see. And I kind of usually, if I would say that maybe Tillman, if we made this presentation 10 years ago with lots of people implementing it, people would say, well, that's quite impossible to do. Yeah. And I think there's multiple ways of how we can start thinking what kind of counterfactuals we can build in HEX to be able to learn. And also I will kind of talk a little bit how we can leverage existing data and novel methods in counterfactuals. As always, please do ask your questions, and we're happy to address them as I go along and after the session ends. Okay, so why counterfactual and which counterfactual? And I think this is kind of what building on what Tillman kind of started saying, is that we need to look in terms of who gets a treatment, in terms of support and whatever kind of intervention that might be versus kind of the control. And also, do we use an experimental kind of method or design, or we have an observational study? Are we in a stable setting, or are we in a humanitarian conflict settings? And all these all together kind of are key for us to kind of think about how we can bring this counterfactual into measure. Because the way we choose a different counterfactual might affect the way we measure outcomes, right? And a certain extent. So in the best randomized control trial, we'll be able to kind of measure with this what we call the common trends, that we know that this is the same group, and then with whatever measure we measure in terms of alpha, which is the difference between after and before between those two groups, can be attributed only by the intervention itself. But the more they move towards the more observational kind of studies, where counterfactuals are built on matching techniques, the impact there might be, it's a bit maybe undermeasured or overestimated or underestimated to a certain extent, right? So one of the things one might think, particularly that we know from different examples that might help us work, moving beyond from pure randomization, is to do factorial designs without a pure control group. And that might, for example, this can be providing agricultural input alone, or we can provide, for example, value chain support alone, like by building SMEs or having linkages to sellers, for example, in a setting like Yemen at the local level. So we can test them separately, but also we can test them in a factorial, so together, right? So in a sense, that might be beneficial in the sense that everybody will receive some type of support, but we can still randomize who received both of them in a sense, and kind of try to measure these kind of impacts. So there's that kind of might absorb a little bit the issue about having a pure control group. But of course, the advantage of it is that that can be rapid, because we know if implementing partners have kind of identified the target locations, they identify the interventions, and then everybody gets something, but to a different intensity, to a different extent, in terms of interaction, you know? So everybody's kind of happy at the end. However, it does not help us answer what are the impacts of this particular intervention, right? So going back to my case study, that we know that, for example, agriculture support improves food security, that's good enough. So we know let's provide agricultural support, but we think if we provide agricultural input, plus maybe irrigation or plus market linkages, how that will kind of improve the food security another level, right? So in a sense, we'll try to kind of build on the existing interventions to kind of cluster them. How we cluster them, I think that matters. If we can randomize some part of it, in terms of as part of the factorial design, that will be very beneficial, right? Particularly, and we see it also, for example, in the case of Syria, where we've done research for over 10 years, that we're moving more from the humanitarian type of assistance towards more resilience building. And that's important to kind of start staggering different types of intervention and to see what works and what doesn't work, particularly around food systems and local productions in a country like Syria, that you want to look kind of the bottom-up approaches. Yeah, so that might be something one can consider in certain situations. Yeah, that might also be okay. The other one would what we call the phased-in designs, and this is if the program implementation is infeasible to do in all villages or for all target populations. And this is something that it happens more often than we think it is. So where we see that certain organizations, either because of kind of different funding seasonalities, or because of issues in terms of accessing multiple funds or implementations, or capacity at the ground to be able to reach some households or the other. And then the idea is that we cannot reach everybody. Yeah. So and in a sense, what we can do, or we kind of leverage across this design, that we know that they want to reach 1 million, 100,000, let's say, a household, and we can, in a sense, say 50,000 can receive food aid, and the 50,000 will receive it next 6 months. And in a sense, you can have this kind of staggered design around it, and which means is that everybody will receive anything, but the treatment tomorrow will be the control for today, right? So in a sense, we can measure the effect, and then everybody will receive everything. This way, everybody's happy and shouldn't create a challenge. Of course, we can still randomize who receives before or after, but also if we have a bigger observation, we can still capture these kind of differences early on. I will describe this a bit more later that might require more balancing techniques and whatnot, right? So advantage is easier to convince people to provide or to take part in a study if they know that they're going to still receive support at one point. But of course, as we know in experimental evidence and research, that the anticipation of receiving an intervention might change your response, right? So this is what other people mentioned in terms of the bias, particularly around kind of behavioral outcomes, right? So it might be good for measuring specific outcomes like food security, maybe productivity of agriculture, but around maybe other types of more behavioral type or maybe preferences or other types of outcomes that you might believe it might be much more difficult to kind of anticipate around those lines. So I hope that is clear. The third one, and I think this is we do also quite often, particularly around larger interventions rather than have specific interventions, which is, for example, say the Food Agriculture Organization in Sudan is distributing seeds or vaccinations to multiple villages. Also, they're doing it in staggering. They're going to reach some villages. Then, or they're going to also provide other irrigation for other villages. So we start thinking, moving away from the individual to the cluster, right? And that might help us kind of observe the impact, and they kind of make it much easier to manage it. It will kind of reduce also kind of whatever contamination that might happen because we work with villages or different clusters. Will help us also kind of measure spillover effects if you were interested in those, if you also interview households within the village that didn't receive the direct intervention. So there is multiple aspects of it that might be beneficial. However, also like untreated clusters might feel unhappy in a sense that they're not receiving part of the thing, but it might be an easier way to do it. And from an implementation point of view, particularly that we've seen in settings like, for example, like Syria or in Sudan and other maybe conflict-affected setting, that might be easier to work at this level, yeah, rather than to work at the individual level in terms of the randomization or the constructing of the counterfactuals at this level, right? The only issue, and I think this is something that people who are a bit more tech savvy will understand, that if we work at the cluster, we need bigger clusters, we need bigger villages, yeah? So this might be beneficial for large agricultural interventions or big program support, but not might be specific for specific small interventions, right? Might not be the right one to do, yeah? Which we also think is also randomization around the cutoff. This is something that's not usually done in the traditional impact evaluations in peaceful settings, but might be beneficial in humanitarian emergency settings. Let's suppose an earthquake takes place or another flooding takes place where with the vicinity of the people who were affected directly by the flood will need support. However, as soon as you go spatially outside, the people still affected by the flooding, but to a lesser extent. And to work with international organizations who have to come in quickly, maybe you say, look, yeah, we understand that you need to reach everybody within the flooded area. However, from the people around the peripheral of the flooding area, maybe there's a potential to see who might receive support or not. Yeah, if you can randomize, for example, who might receive support or not. And that might be helpful. In case that's not possible, we can also reconstruct what we call, if the cutoff is non-random, yeah? We cannot randomize it, we can use what we call regression discontinuity design. So please go ahead and the idea of it is that we can create a counterfactual such that people, if they lived 200 meters away from the flood, they could have been affected by the flood. So they're very similar to the houses that were affected by the flood, right? Spatially, yeah, and on mainly other dimensions, but they were not affected by the flood, right? So some will receive the intervention, other not. And if we control for those different flood exposures, we'll be able to kind of generate a counterfactual, which helps us kind of measure the impacts of any intervention related to the shock that's been exposed, right? So this is something that can be done and it's been done and in multiple other settings as well. 5, if we cannot do any kind of randomization to a certain extent, what we do is kind of reconstruct synthetic control groups. This is becoming more and more feasible given that we have more and more data that's part outside of the impact evaluation itself, right? So like we have additional data, and this is kind of arguably the most important innovation that people believe in the policy evaluation, the literature in the past 15 or 20 years by now. And it might also be beneficial, particularly around interventions around food system and agricultural interventions. And the idea is that we get information from other, so we can use other existing household survey data, or we can use other external data like conflict exposure. We can use agroclimatic data from satellite data. We can use temperature data. We can use other health surveys that has been conducted before the intervention took place. And in a sense, try to reconstruct a control group from all these pre-treatment information that we have in order to be able to compare that, right? And then we can do this more linearly, like we put it in a linear model, but also using machine learning, we can also do it non-parametrically, parametrically. It is effective in places where we have enough data. Yeah, that might be the case of Yemen because we don't have data at all, but might be useful for the case, for example, of Sudan or Darfur, or in other places where we have been working for the last 20 years and we have collected lots of data. Yeah, so it requires lots of putting lots of data together, either from the same households or from other information that might help us reconstruct such control groups. If we look in terms of the panel structure of it, that we need much more 2 periods of pre-intervention to do that, and requires larger sample sizes, right, to be able to do this proper matching and in terms of this equitability. But this is something that it's becoming more and more possible given that we have more and more data in humanitarian conflict settings, right, which wasn't the case 10 and 15 years ago. Great. Okay, so this is from terms of design, and as I said, like I want to give a couple of examples of what kind of other data that we have used and that might be also used in such settings. We have discussed the idea of being able to use the phone data. We've kind of tested this a bit more rigorously during the COVID crisis, where we couldn't access household for good reasons, right? In terms of to reduce the infectious disease transmission. So lots of people started kind of relying on phone data and internet surveys, and the most important is to kind of do it high frequency. You can combine it with existing baseline data, for example, and lots of people have done that to do impact evaluations, like to kind of try to reach household, ask them some small questions about the different outcomes that you're interested in, and try to kind of generate a counterfactual that kind of cut the costs, and that might be much more useful. It could be good for tracing also households at the individual and both at the community level, particularly around displaced household that you might not be able to reach in house-to-house survey. Now, of course, it depends on the intensity of how many people you can reach or the outreach, but we know that there's a huge increase, particularly like, for example, I saw last statistics in Africa that around now 89% of all Africans across the whole Africa have access to mobile phones. And and which is something like great, yeah. And I think one can kind of leverage that. Sure, we're missing the 11% who might be the most vulnerable, who might be the most affected by conflict and disasters, but at least in a sense, it's becoming much more accessible. These tools that can be used also for survey data. And we can measure, also collect non-response, particularly if we have like baseline data from that, and experiment in different how we can do questions, right? So I think this is something that can be picked up and used. And this is also what I think Melody kind of mentioned, that even if we conduct the household health survey data, most of the monitoring and evaluation of the data and the high frequency checks that we do is all at the back end. So we can create those systems to ensure that any biases in measurement or recall biases or how enumerator bias or quality checks can all be done remotely in a sense, right? So all these things can be done and provided quick feedback back to the enumeration team if you create the structure around the data collection that allows it. So this is possible, and it's becoming much more feasible, yeah, and it's much more easier to use. You don't have to be, as a researcher, always on the ground during the data collection, so to speak, yeah. Here's another example that we've done in a paper, the Journal Refugee Studies, where we leverage large administrative data of all Syrian refugees with the UNHCR, registered with the UNHCR in Syria, which is in the hundreds of thousands. And the idea of it is that we have this much information that they gather. So this registration data has been used for putting this information about the household, about their income, about if they have permits, about if they are allowed to work. So all this has been done through registration. And in a sense, if we have such big data, we'll be able to reconstruct, as you said, the synthetic control group or other type of control groups using any propensity score matching, right? This is something that we're able to do. And the bigger data that you have, Of course, you're still unobservable characteristics that might affect it, but to a certain extent, the additional cost is very low to the additional benefit because this data already exists, right? And the idea is to make sure, and I think this is maybe for those who work in organizations that do collect registration data or administrative data among refugees or displaced households or within your organization as beneficiaries, that even the registration data can contain enough information, simple outcome variables around security, simple outcome variables around income, small measurement that might help allow to use this data for additional research, right? So, and I'm happy that also organizations, and I think maybe Tim will speak about it later on in his conclusion, that they're opening up to allow the use of such data, right? Which allows us to impact evaluate specific policies. In this case, we did it for the effect of the impact of giving work permits, and we measure that on the income and food security of household by doing this matching at this level within the Syrian refugees. Similarly, if I may also say that also there's other types of data, like for example, like the armed conflict location event data. There's also other data from the OCHA, from the HUM data, humanitarian data, where they also be able to allow us to geographically and geospatially to be able to match other characteristics and information around different exposure to shocks, different exposures to humanitarian emergencies like disasters or flooding. We have temperature data that's very frequent and can be also integrated. And given that most of the household information that we have, to a certain extent, we have some geolocation information, all this information can be matched. In a sense, we can have one household who live in this setting. If we have one baseline observation or any other observation, if we have some geolocation information, we're able to kind of generate a whole attribute around this household, right? In the past 12 months, what kind of shocks they have been exposed to, conflict, were located. So it will help us to understand better the contextual factors, right? In order to also, one, to assess better, to generate a control group, but also to understand also how these different exposures to shocks and other types of factors in these settings, which are crucial, shape both the people's behavior, welfare, and the programming around it. Yeah. So this is something I also wanted to kind of mention briefly. In this study, also, for example, here we used the ACLED data, which is the armed conflict location event data, and we took the number of fatalities in a year before we did the endline data in Syria, and then we associated for each household that theoretically, what's the exposure of conflict that this household might have faced if he was living in this region in Syria. And we had a smaller sample, and usually when we want to do heterogeneity analysis, which Tillman showed earlier on in his example as well in Northeast Nigeria, that we need a huge sample size, particularly if you want to break down these different effects by gender and by location. But given that there's new methods as well, like including machine learning, like the causal forest models, we're happy to send some literature papers later on, like about the paper references for everybody to see. That might allow us to also, even with a small sample size, that non-parametrically we're able to measure these different impacts for different subgroups. Right? In this example, we see that we broke down the effect on food security, the impact of agricultural intervention on food security, and we broke it down between male and female, and between the different exposures of violence events. And here, for example, as Tillman showed, we see that female-headed household, on average, regardless of the exposure of violence, are more likely to benefit from this program. So, which is a good sign that maybe tell implementers that we should support more female-headed households. They might gain much more benefit from it. But what we also interestingly find in this study is that households who live in moderately affected conflict settings benefit more from the intervention compared to households who didn't receive it also in moderately affected conflict settings. So that implies there's this specific intervention, which was provision of agricultural seeds, will not have worked in a peaceful setting. It might have not been enough to make the treatment group better than the control group. And also it might have not worked in a very extreme conflict setting, like in the above here, because farmers don't have time to grow their seed before an event happened that they have to reallocate. Yeah, so the risk is higher. So in essence, in a peaceful setting, the control group had a better alternative to generate better food security rather than growing seeds. And in the very highly affected settings, it was not sufficient at all. Maybe cash would have been much more effective, or in-kind support rather than seeds, right? So this kind of heterogeneity is key, particularly where this context is very volatile, as some of you have said, and unstable. And to measure these impacts that might change over time is quite significant. And machine learning is one tool to be able to allow us to do that without compromising sample sizes. And lastly, this is also from an ongoing work we're doing. So this is also in case in Syria. So we were interested to measure the impact of an irrigation rehabilitation program in Deir ez-Zor in Syria, which was practically non-accessible for anybody. But what we reverted is that we knew where the implementation is taking place, and when we use satellite data, and we kind of measured the satellite. We got satellite pictures from the same area from before the war, during the war, before the intervention, after the intervention, which was between 2018 and 2020. And what we also did is that we also identified other similar control villages based on previous, this is the NDVI, which is the vegetation index, right? It's a vegetation index that we can measure how much kind of crop productivity or water usage and crop productivity within the region. And what we could do is take historical values between this to be able to match a proper control group similarly, and then we can measure the effect of the irrigation rehabilitation and kind of use machine learning to delineate the effects of waterfall, like rainfall from irrigation, right? So what I'm trying to say with this message is that we didn't even do any household surveys. And yes, it is still in its infancy. Yes, accessing such data might be problematic. It might be effective for, let's say, if you want to measure health outcomes or child anthropometrics or nutrition, but might be for people who work on measuring agricultural productivity, water usage, climate resilience, change resilience, and other factors that can be measured from geospatial space, that it might be now even more possible, right? And if you integrate those with existing pre-intervention survey data, that might also kind of enrich it much more, right? So this is something feasible. And if you want to like more, please, we'll also send references to this data. So, and to this paper, sorry. So lots to say, and I know, and it was really hard to kind of zoom down. I just wanted to kind of give you a little bit of a menu of these different designs and different data and methods and what we can use in such a setting, also to study the impact of certain interventions, right? So that it's becoming much more feasible than before, and the tools that are available now are much more accessible for everyone to kind of implement. And I think in the next stage, Tilman will talk about how to make this more workable, in terms of the partnership and how to make it more, to conclude on those points. And we're happy to take more questions. I see any questions I see lots of thank yous.
There is one, Ghassan, only from Omobolaji. And he was asking if we can go through again the
I'm happy to do that. Why not? Let me just find it. Number 3.
So maybe it's is it number 3? Yeah.
Yes. I mean to cluster at the village level, exactly. Yeah. So some villages, let's say, would receive seeds, and some villages will receive seeds plus irrigation, right? So in a sense, or some villages would receive some support, others would receive other support, right? So this way, it will make it much more easier to kind of administer such design. And also in terms of implementation, right? So what we do is we measure the effect still at the individual level. We see improvement of food security for either direct beneficiaries in the village, and then we can kind of aggregate this at the village level, and then kind of measure those with the clustering at the village level. But what also really beneficial, and in some certain situations we've done this, that we also can measure the indirect effects. If we interview households who were not direct beneficiaries, but in a treated village, right? So in a sense, what we want to create here is a village portfolio. Yeah, let's say this village or this community has received intervention X, Y, Z. Yeah, it could be randomized, but it could be also non-random. And we know village Y, which is very similar, received only X and Z. Yeah, so this kind of intervention. So there's only one difference of intervention between them, right? So, and if we be able to construct enough sample of villages that might help us. It will help us to measure the impacts of this additional intervention. But also, if we interview non-beneficiaries, we can also measure the spillover effects. Because I think when we start talking about humanitarian emergencies and conflict settings, there's lots of especially needs now to say that we want to move away from just providing humanitarian support. We want to also start building resilience. So most of this humanitarian type of intervention has to have a resilience building component, particularly around food systems, right? Because you want to ensure that there's local production. You want to ensure that the markets function within the community, that households who are non-beneficiaries can also benefit, right? So all these things are important to measure, and you can only do it at the cluster level, so to speak. Because if you do it at the individual level randomization or other type of things, it might be much more difficult to measure these things more effectively. I hope that answered it. Great. Any other questions? Rabba, I think we will leave if you want to type it down, or we maybe at the end of the session after Tillman, we can ask more questions if you would like to talk. Yeah, maybe that's fine. That's fine, Elena. If somebody wants to, maybe we'll do it in the last
Of course.
5 minutes only. Okay, I will give it then
To ask a
to
question.
Tillman just to conclude, and then we will open for 1 or 2 questions from the audience. If that's
Yeah, thank you, Hassan. I think that was a lot of material, and it's a relatively long session, so I hope it wasn't too much. Thanks to everybody for staying. I will just try to wrap up, and I think I'll return to a couple of the topics that have been raised before, so hopefully that will be useful and still leave enough time for discussion at the end. Yeah, I look forward to your questions. I always enjoy them a lot. So next slide, please. So I think the first thing I want to highlight is, and we have given different examples of what we can study. We can do 2 things if we do research or learning or studies in humanitarian emergency and conflict settings. We can learn about people. We can learn about, how do they live? What's happening? How do people organize their lives? How do they manage to eat? How do they manage to earn money? How do they move around? What determines survival and what makes people happy or satisfied or so that's at a very basic level. That's just trying to understand, fellow human beings and how they manage in these settings. But then sort of a level above that, there's a question which to many of us is, of course, also important, how and why and if interventions work, what is the assistance we can give and how can we support people in their challenges of living through crisis and these livelihoods in crisis, and how can interventions improve, I don't know, income or consumption or food security, and or what part of a program worked best, or or why did we obtain the outcomes. And so there's both types of learning going on in crisis settings, and both are important, and I think we need to sometimes differentiate that. We can't learn about interventions if we don't understand the lives and livelihoods of people in crisis settings. Yeah, so let's keep both sort of levels of analysis in mind. That's one thing. Next slide, please. And then what I think is really important, and I've tried to highlight it earlier, interventions should have some sort of theory, right? They should have a theory of change, or they should have an assumption about what's going on. And it's important to make that explicit. And sometimes that's a difficult bit, but it sometimes isn't like particularly complex. You don't need to be a researcher in order to write down a theory of change, but you should just make explicitly your assumption. If I give people a training, then they can get a better job, or some sort of if-then statement. But it's not just about job trainings and whether you get a job. It's also about what technically we sometimes call cross-partial derivative. So, one thing impacting another thing, sort of across different dimensions. Yeah. So, for example, are hungry people more likely to riot? Or do people who have a job, are they more peaceful? Yeah. So that then combines 2 different areas and 2 different domains, and of course that makes the theory of change a little more knotty and a little more complex. Yeah, because maybe we know a lot about jobs and about trainings. Yeah, but we know less about peace. Or maybe we know a lot about peace building, but we know less about jobs. And so we might need teams in the intervention design who also understand both domains and to bring these different strands of knowledge together. Yeah, and that's just, again, at the basic level. And then the level above that is for interventions, do food aid projects build peace, or do employment projects build peace? Yeah, so we don't just need to look at whether employment projects build jobs, but also do they support social cohesion perhaps, or people living peacefully side by side. And yeah, so things get a bit more complicated, but I think it's worth in conflict and humanitarian emergency settings to make these assumptions explicit, because that makes it easier later to learn from the setting. Yeah, maybe we said, oh, we had an assumption that people work side by side, that would make them, more understanding of each other, but we found they actually ended up fighting at work all the time, yeah, when they came from two different groups, and or the other way around. Yeah, that and so it's important to make these things explicit. Okay. Next, please. Thank you. So this then directly comes to clarifying the aim. Yeah. So, if you're just running a normal program in a normal setting, then you don't have to worry about these things. But if you are in a hex type setting, then, maybe you have to adjust your programming. And either because jobs work differently, level one, yeah, in a complex setting, or because you're actually trying to have this dual purpose. Yeah, you're trying to create jobs, but also make people live more safely and securely and peacefully next to each other. But then maybe you need a specific component on that. Yeah, maybe they need a peace building component in this context. Yeah, and so you can have a whole range of programs. Yeah, so again, you can have normal interventions in normal settings. You can have more complex, or you can have normal interventions adapted for more complex settings, or you can have additional components in there which then explicitly address the issue of instability or lack of peace or lack of social cohesion. Yeah, and so it's very hard even to learn across different contexts. Yeah, and so we need to make that explicit and not just say, oh, but in Switzerland this intervention worked, and therefore I'm going to try that in a conflict setting as well. Yeah, next slide, please. And we heard about a lot of possible objections today, yeah, which these mad scientists on the right, yeah, you could picture on the right, you could object to that. You could say it's unethical to have an impact evaluation emergency, or it's not safe, or we're already doing great. Why should we study that? Or maybe this looks pretty complex. How are we going to do that? We don't have the capacity for that. And I don't want to now run through all these arguments again, but I think my point is, if you start breaking down the project, and if you start thinking about what your needs are, and if you think about what you know already and what maybe you don't know, usually there are answers somewhere, and maybe you need to adapt the research design a bit to make it ethical. Yeah, maybe you need to think very carefully about safety and security. But a lot of people live in insecure environments. Doesn't mean we can't work there and improve there. And maybe you need to challenge whether you really are doing the best thing given the context and the complexity that we just outlined. Yeah, and maybe you can work with partners to, even if you're a small organization, not sure how to organize your learning, maybe you can find partners who can do it with you. Yeah, so there are answers, and we're trying to encourage you to consider them and not just put a, sorry, this doesn't work for us type thing. Yeah, because often we can learn a lot, and it's very valuable to do so. Next, please. And then your learning sort of journey, might look like this. So, this green curve that sort of slopes up and then plateaus, at the beginning. And if there's a setting which is environment or challenge which is new, and which your organization maybe has never met before, or never encountered, or never worked there before, then you might have very little knowledge on learning or capacity. Yeah, and then you sort of move forward step by step through these different phases, and you get some basic evidence on concepts, like just what does it mean to work in a earthquake zone, for example. Yeah, and then you slowly move towards research on impacts, maybe. Yeah, what impact do we have when we work there? Then you start learning on implementation. Is it better to do it like this, or is it better to do like that? Sort of A/B testing. It's quite subtle already, so maybe the diminishing returns from learning. Yeah, and eventually you basically know how to do it, and you have sort of reached the plateau, and you have best practice, and you can basically work in many of these settings. But in order to reach that, you need to do a lot of learning, or other people need to do a lot of learning from which you can benefit. And so it's completely normal, if you work in a very low evidence environment, to say it's very unclear, how to proceed and what's best. But if you work in a field where a lot of studies have been done, then maybe you should say, okay, I should go out there and read them, and maybe I don't need to do another study myself, because I can benefit from other people's previous work in this field. Yeah, so I'd encourage you to think and reflect on where you are in the learning journey, and are you early on, or are you right in the middle, or are you sort of maybe a bit further? And as an institution, also to set yourself goals. We want to move from one phase to the next in the next 3 years, maybe. Yeah, but you're not going to reach the plateau thing, like just in a couple of months. Yeah, that's a long process. Next, please. And finally, I think what's really important is that learning is a very collaborative process. It requires many actors requires the implementers, it requires the beneficiaries, it requires maybe enumerators, it requires, research design people, and maybe communicators. It's very networked, and it's very collaborative. Here you have the image of the the guy on the moon, yeah, and he only got there because there are a lot of people on the ground, who had different roles and different capacities and different expertise to support them. Yeah, and I think they were all sort of pushing the boundary of what they knew and how they could do it. But because they worked together, they managed to achieve that. Yeah, and so I think that's the same when it comes to M&E, for example, research. I'm always surprised how divided our communities are when we're all interested in figuring things out and learning. Yeah, and you might want mixed teams from different disciplines, within your organizations. You might want partnerships with external organizations. You need support from the top. To say, let's learn, let's be a learning organization. Yeah, but you also need funding to make that possible, and you need to it's cohesion around that goal. Yeah, and it takes time. Like if you want to work in an emergency setting, how does your HR adapt to that, and your finance and your procurement? These things can be different. Yeah, so let me maybe on that point I saw a question pop up. What is your recommendation? How much preparation time is needed to implement a rigorous impact evaluation in a HEX setting? Yeah, I think it depends. So if an emergency is a sort of sudden occurrence, like an earthquake, and you go, wow, we need to help and we want to do it well and we want to learn from it, and you hadn't previously thought about it, then it might take quite a lot of time to consider all these challenges and to mainstream them. And maybe it's better to sort of rush ahead and do what you think you can do best. But if on the other hand you say, we regularly get called out into new settings, and let's prepare and let's have a sort of on-the-shelf design, then maybe you can spend half a year designing a sort of a likely research or learning strategy. And then when the moment comes where you want to deploy it, then maybe it's a question of a couple of weeks. And also if the implementation teams have been exposed to this before and don't see it as a burden, as something that they have to do just to please headquarter, then it might be much easier. Yeah? How much the budget is very difficult to say, because it depends a lot on the context. Yeah, some impact evaluations are quite expensive because they work with large samples. But if it's a really like flagship project and you're doing something really novel, it might be worth it. And the learning curve is early on. If on the other hand, you basically know how to build a primary school in a safe rural setting, then maybe don't run an impact evaluation around that. Yeah, and maybe you just need to sort of fine tune your implementation, and you can do that with more qualitative methods. Yeah, so I'm sorry, it's very difficult to say. It can be, for a very large multi-million-dollar project, can be as much as 1% of the project sum, which is a lot of money. Yeah, but the point is, if you're not sure which of your A and B, which of your modality works better, then it could be you're wasting half your budget on one modality which doesn't work at all. Yeah, and we've encountered this in our projects where we basically looked at two different components, and we had to tell the donor, I'm sorry, component one is really not very good. And often they said, yeah, we had a feeling it did, but it's a lot of people doing it, so we thought we had to do it as well. And then we showed them the evidence, and they were actually happy to tune that down. Okay. Let's go on. Thank you very much. If you're interested in our newsletter, feel free to subscribe. You can hold your phone or device to that QR code. But otherwise, I think now it's a good time to ask some more questions, and maybe also back to Hassan to lead this seminar. Who's been
Thank you, Tilman. Thank you very much. This is thank you for all the engagement on all ends from everybody, both in the example. I think this has been very useful to see how different people see, and we're happy also to see that there's lots of responses who people believe it's becoming feasible, and we try to show how we can make it much more feasible and the requirements that's needed. Then I can hand back to Elena to close the session.
Sure. Thank you so much for that very interesting and informative learning lab. We really appreciate the time that you've put in as a facilitation team to prepare this session for us. And thank you to everyone who attended today. I've put a link to the A&H Academy Week 2024 program in the chat, where you can find information about the other learning labs that will be happening later today and over the next few days. And again, we'll post a recording to this session on our website in the coming weeks. So big applause to our facilitation team. Thank you.